going back to the antiquity, the two most famous accounts really come from Plato, who is a totally credible source, I think. I don't think anybody would doubt that. And yet, for some reason, with his account of Atlantis, many people take issue and say, well, this is a foundational myth, which I always caution people, because not just of the overwhelming correlations between his account and later information that he had no knowledge of, say geological, archaeological, and later, as we'll get into, some of the remote viewing evidence. But if you just stick with what Plato said, I think it's quite fascinating and quite revelatory, and also quite statistically impossible that he would have said what he said if he was creating a quote unquote foundational myth. And I should also add, a lot of these beliefs are later superimposed on what he said. I look at what he said to the best of my ability, and just to start off there, as I mentioned in my book, in the character of Socrates, who's really Plato speaking through the dialogue, as he's describing to Critias in the eponymous dialogue, he says regarding Atlantis, every word of this story is true, as strange as this sounds. And so I think it's quite odd to begin a quote unquote myth with the disclaimer to the reader that actually this is a bizarre story, but it's true. And so that's the first thing, point of departure that I take with people that just say this is all fictional. Now, what does he say in regards to, say, a date of this event? Well, he says the story was brought down to him from a distant relative, from the first Athenian lawgiver, Solon, who lived in the mid, let's say, 7th century BC, somewhere around there. And that gives us a date, let's say roughly of 620, 630 BC. Let's just use that date, 650 BC, just to round it out. It's not exactly clear when Solon was born and died to the best of our ability, but let's just say for the purpose of this discussion, Solon lived around 650 BC. Well, Plato says Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which brings us to around roughly 9,600 BC, or 9,650 BC. Now, many people, because that date seems extreme, have bent over backwards and bent themselves into a pretzel to try to rationalize, well, that's not really what he meant. Well, he added a zero. Well, that was mistranslated because the Greeks weren't using years the same way. I found no evidence for that. I actually think that date is accurately translated. And I think it's an incredibly important date because, unbeknownst to Plato, but known to us, that's basically within plus or minus a few hundred years, depending on which geologist you ask, the end, officially, of the Ice Age. And we now know, almost I would say beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Ice Age did end cataclysmic over a period of hundreds of years, and likely due to comet fragment impacts, as Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, many others have noted. So I would say right there, if we were just looking at this objectively, regardless of what the civilization looked like, its exact timeline, but if we're just taking that as a point of departure, we have an incredibly credible source in the, I would argue, progenitor of Western philosophy, giving a very specific date that aligns almost directly with modern geological evidence for a cataclysmic ending to a human epoch. So I would say right there, just as my opener, that's an incredibly strong start before we get into any of the more esoteric stuff or any of the pre-Platonic sources who mentioned him, which we'll talk about on other episodes, or any of the latter cross-cultural, let's say, references or similarities or inexplicable things that Atlantis would explain. We just take the foundation from, say, Plato
that's an incredibly important correlation, I think. The end of the Younger Dryas and this 9,600 BC date that Plato claims Solon was told by the temple priests at sites.